Okay, so this presentation is based on a paper that was published in Biosemiotics Journal last year. It's open access, and you'll find a more thorough treatment of some of the arguments and ideas I present here. The paper is entitled Qualitative Attribution, Phenomenal Experience and Being. It's in three parts, as is this presentation. So, even from a distance, there is something about the Earth that makes it stand out from many other planets. Physical properties such as electromagnetic waves, chemicals, and vibrations have all acquired new meaning. Many have become properties of a unique and biological kind. So if we do look at the Earth from a distance, we notice that the atmosphere, seas and landscapes reflect the impact of this biological meaning. I don't mean reflect that physically, it's the biological meaning itself that we see. And this is what makes the Earth stand out from other planets. Now, the environment undoubtedly has influenced the evolution of species. But what I'm trying to emphasize really is that species have had an impact on the environment due to this biological meaning. So it's a two-way process. It is this lineage-environment interaction that has led to the progressive evolution of biological meaning from the mere physical. I call this lineage-environment interaction a form of discourse. So typically the term discourse is used in reference to language. But I think of it much more broadly than this. I argue that discourse can be said to take place where any interactive mechanism creates meaning whose value is in some way justified. So replication is one such mechanism. It facilitates a discourse with the environment that takes place over a generational timeline. So over generations, there is a progressively meaningful correspondence between the evolving physiologies of a lineage and the environment. But how we understand this idea of meaningful correspondence between physiologies and the environment, physical properties, how might we understand the ontological nature of biological meaning? Well, in answering this question, I think there are two elements. Firstly, due to replication, biochemical mechanisms tend to evolve in a way that assimilates physical properties in qualitative terms. What this idea of qualitative ascription means is that they tend to differentiate physical properties by assimilating them in a way that has a bearing on their actual or potential merit in regard to the perpetuation of the lineage. I'll come back to this idea of actual and potential merit in a second. Secondly, biochemical mechanisms tend to reflect the relevance that qualitative characterizations have on the needs of the individual in successfully perpetuating its lineage. So relevance here relates to such things as nutritional, restorative, functional, or replicative demands and so forth. So coming back to this idea of actual and potential merit, a biochemical mechanism might evolve in a way that assimilates an extremely high temperature and instigate a recoil mechanism. There's obvious survival benefit in this because it's creating distance between the organism and the physical property of extreme heat. So what we see here is an obvious direct correspondence between the property itself and the mechanism that's instigating recoil. So here, that's an example of actual merit in the biological mechanism itself. But many physical properties do not bear a direct correspondence with their value to life. So examples would include colors from the electromagnetic spectrum, sounds, many smells. With such properties, there is an indeterminacy of value, but their biochemical assimilation is clearly of obvious potential benefit. This indeterminacy of stimulus value is why we must combine both the qualitative and the relevancy elements as follows. Due to a generational discourse, the biochemical assimilation of environmental particulars tends to evolve in a way that assigns a qualitative ascription whose merit or value can subsequently be qualified by the relevance that those ascriptions might or might not have on an organism, on an individual's changing needs and survival demands. Now, if we consider the infinite range of possible stimulants of indeterminate value, from every colour, hue and shade to every scent, sensation, every sound frequency, sound cluster and volume, and so on, we might hypothesize that they all have cause to serve as a role in a complex qualitative array. Sometimes I call this the internal qualitative milieu of varying and subtle biological characterization and description. Now, this must be the case because there are undeniable benefits in doing so. Whoops. So I'm of the view that this qualitative array in more sophisticated organisms becomes the foundations in the characterization of qualitative phenomenal content. This means, of course, that the qualitative ascription to the physical is fundamentally biochemical, not neurological in foundation, and also that it is present in the very simplest of life forms. So, concluding part one, before the mechanism of replication existed on Earth, physical properties had no qualities. Replication has since led to the emergence of a novel ontological category where physical properties have become properties with species-specific qualitative attributions. So for those interested in emergentism, the importance is in recognizing that the emergent of interest is not life itself, nor is it replication. Rather, the emergent of interest is the qualitative ascription to the physical domain. For those interested in causation, it is notable that a generational discourse subverts classical causal mechanics. A lot can be said about that, but I haven't got time to go into those points in detail. So part two, phenomenal experience. There are limitations to assimilating the world qualitatively. The individual creature itself is enslaved to the preordained physiological dispositions that have been handed down by its lineage. But the qualitative assimilation of the physical does present an opportunity. This opportunity is realized when a creature develops the capability to rapidly weight its qualitative assimilations and subsequently prioritize its motivations accordingly. The neural mechanism makes this possible. They can rapidly interconnect across distance. Additionally, they have the ability to attenuate and amplify biochemical imperatives. This facilitates an ongoing interplay between a creature's evaluations of its internal qualitative milieu and the consequences of its actions. This has two consequences. Firstly, the rapid weighting and prioritizing of qualitative assimilations sets in play an assimilation, evaluation, and behavioral feedback. The process thereby characterizes a constantly changing real-time experiential discourse between the individual creature and its environment. Secondly, a real-time experiential discourse necessarily differentiates an individual's qualitatively assimilated world spatially and temporally. The experienced world obtains a spatial and temporal frame of reference that is particular to the individual. So time and space as an experiential ontology comes into existence for the first time in creatures whose neural mechanisms can rapidly weight and prioritize in real time the individual's qualitative assimilations of the environment. This is a difficult concept to articulate, but essentially it's the idea that in order to evaluate an array of qualitative assimilations, you're effectively spatially and temporally delineating things as they, because that is what makes them important, largely, is their proximity and properties like that. So that's why the time and space element becomes is vital in the evaluation process. Another way of saying this is that the sophisticated neural mechanisms are responsible for the emergence of the embedded subjective perspective. This counts as a novel ontological category. It's the individual creature can be said to be conscious of a real-time changing phenomenon of experience, which defines the boundaries of its particular space-time. So part 3 is being. Evaluating a qualitatively assimilated world creates a subjective, spatial, temporal, and qualitative perspective that has boundaries. For such creatures, there is nothing beyond the subjective experience phenomenon itself. Consequently, creatures with a subjective worldview communicate only to a level that reflects the significance, relevance, and character of their experiential inclinations. There is no additional insight into or about the nature of their subjective experience, and therefore no inclination to communicate purposefully about any such insights. But I'm guessing in early hominid, a third new ontological category began to emerge due to an increasingly sophisticated cognitive capability. This capability led to the abstraction of general principles about the rules governing the spatial, temporal, and qualitative world of experience. These principles concerning the objective world are all interconnected. They're principles about the objective world, effectively. So in identifying them, the individual is committed to developing a comprehensive construct of principled notions or proto-conceptual interpretations concerning reality. I claim that this process engages a conceptual discourse, introspective conceptual discourse that reassesses the veracity of the individual's interpretations. This discourse initially is pre-linguistic. It's like a dawning realization in the individual. And among many other things, this introspection evokes a sense of personal revelation. This revelation can be explained as follows. If an individual begins to conceive that the spatial temporal world exists as a rule-bound, factual, and objective certainty, then that thinker unavoidably develops a conception concerning their own existential identity. The individual is provoked into considering that if it conceives of existence, it too must exist to be conceiving. So there is a circularity of thought. This amounts to a subjective self-identification that inevitably characterizes the conception of and belief in the individual's own existential being. Inevitably, when communicating, the individual will not only express the unmoderated feelings that reflect the impact of experience, as do other animals. In addition, the individual will feel compelled to articulate about its evolving conceptual interpretation of reality. In this endeavor, human thought and communication resolves to consider, express, and refine the validity of its conceptualized worldview. subsequently, ideological stances are adopted both by the individual and vigorously defended within social groups and communities due to the existential threat posed by alternative ideologies, because any alternative stance is counters their own sense of existential identity. So as an overview, what I've been talking about is three novel ontological categories. There's the discourse enabled by replication with the environment that leads to the qualitative ascription to the physical. In the second ontological category, we have the emergence of Umwelt with a subjective, real-time experiential discourse. And with the third category, we have conceptual discourse, which is leads to this sense of our individuated existential being. It is a hierarchy, each distinct in terms of the causal nature and in terms of the dynamics of each. What it implies is that there are levels below level 1, and that there is a level or more above 3. Above 3, that hasn't actually evolved yet. It's the implication is that the humans have the capacity to evolve to another ontological level or category, which will be as distinctive as each of the categories are before it. Below 1 is basically pre-biotic, and I think of it as classical physics, where material objects in space travel in that space in time, so time exists in that ontological category with its own meaningful status, although physics doesn't talk of it in those terms. And below that category, at the quantum level, we cease to have this equivalence with time and space. I'm not a physicist, so I'm not quite sure what happens at the quantum level, or possibly even below the quantum level. I think, in a way, that this counts as a universalist proposition. So, in answer to a presentation given yesterday, why be a universalist? Simply because it connects disparate disciplines, and because unifying principles are, as a rule, a thing of beauty. Thank you for listening. Any questions?